Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms, presented by Diligent Institute, your source for the latest and greatest in corporate governance, all in 10 minutes. I'm Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'll be your host. Today, I'm joined by Maureen Ohlhausen, Antitrust and Competition Partner in Wilson Sonsini's DC office, and a former commissioner of the FTC. Maureen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dottie. Glad to be here.
So, Maureen, we talked about doing a deep dive today on the recent Supreme Court ruling that struck down the long-standing Chevron doctrine. So, to start us off, could you take us back in time to that original 1984 ruling and the precedent that it set?
So, in the 1984 Supreme Court ruling, the court decided that if a statute had a grant of authority to an agency, that the court would defer to the agency's interpretation of that authority rather than the court making its decision on what's the best interpretation of that grant of authority. If it was a permissible interpretation, the court would defer to the agency. And the important part about that was that it allowed agencies to look for ambiguities, to take advantage of if Congress wasn't very clear in a statute, to interpret it to their advantage, to have a wider berth of authority. And so that was one of the reasons why Chevron, though it was kind of a bit of a sleeper decision when it came out, eventually ended up having so much impact.
So now that we've got that context, let's come up to speed now and take a look at the Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo ruling that came down earlier this year. Can you just kind of describe to us what that was about, sort of what was happening, and what's the significance of that?
The Chevron doctrine had been under attack for a number of years, and the court and the Supreme Court and some federal courts had been trying to limit its application because it had allowed agencies such a wide latitude to enact regulations and take actions that seem to, in some people's minds, exceed what Congress really intended. So finally, that issue came to a head directly in the Loper Bright case. It involves kind of some obscure regulatory authority, so I won't get into that. But the important part about it was it took on Chevron directly, and the court overturned that 1984 decision, which required courts to defer to a permissible agency interpretation, and also allowed agencies to change that interpretation over time as long as their new interpretation was also considered reasonable. So the Supreme Court in Loper Bright determined that it is up to the courts to determine what is the best interpretation of a congressional delegation of authority in a statute to an agency. So this meant that deference was no longer being given to agencies. The courts would decide what was the best interpretation, which also meant that over time, agencies, based on changes in administrations, couldn't adopt kind of shifting interpretations of these statutory authorities. And so it's going to, I think, in the longer term, have a big impact. Although over time, agencies had tried to move away from relying on Chevron, at least directly, because there was this sense that it was being eroded over time.
So can you give us some examples of the implications of this ruling? I'm thinking specifically about, rulings we've seen come from the SEC or from the EPA. What are some of the implications of the overturning of Chevron?
So there's going to be some really interesting fallout from this, and we'll see over time particular regulations and actions from agencies being challenged under Loper Bright. The idea that the court should go in and determine really what was the best outcome, the best interpretation of that statute. So some of the more, aggressive and controversial interpretations of agency authority will come under serious question. Could be SEC regulations. Certainly, my expertise is in the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC claimed that it had broad authority to do competition rulemaking, and its non-compete rule got struck down, both on the idea that under Loper Bright, the agency wouldn't be given this kind of deference to say that it had this kind of authority. So I think we're going to see it kind of resonate for a number of years, kind of echo throughout courts as these regulations, the existing regulations and actions are challenged, and new any new attempts are also challenged, and eventually come up with more of, I think, a consistent and uniform approach to some of these agency actions over time. So there might be less deviation from one administration to the next.
So, Maureen, you alluded to some of the things that this new ruling might mean. I wondered if you could give us a sense for where things might be heading, and thinking specifically around, what kinds of actions by groups like the FTC we should be keeping an eye on, or any cases that are currently being discussed that we might want to watch.
There have been some really interesting challenges to the FTC and the SEC's ability to do in-house adjudication and some of their broader rulemaking authorities. And I think that the Loper Bright decision will now come into play as these authorities and interpretations are challenged more broadly. So I think it should be a very interesting time. And similarly for other agencies who may have claimed broad, like EPA, FDA, over time, we've seen some broad claims by those agencies and their ability to broadly interpret their statutory grants to engage in a lot of very specific regulation. I think we'll start to see that challenged and become really kind of a more precarious activity for these agencies.
Do you have any sort of best and final thoughts or advice for our director audience? I mean, this is a program that is watched primarily by board directors, and I think a lot of the guidance that we've been talking about is probably more specifically for their legal teams, but I'd love to know any thoughts that you have that we should share with directors specifically around some of these issues.
I think directors, it will be interesting for them to pay attention to what this means for some of the really industry-specific regulations. So if you're a director in a particular industry involving food and drugs, involving EPA kind of environmental issues, energy, things like that, I think it'll be a very interesting time because some of the, when we see political changes, there's often these changes in regulatory interpretations and attempts to do broad rulemaking. I think that will be trimmed back in an interesting way and maybe become more stable over time. So I think those are some of the trends that directors who are active in particular industries should pay attention to. Also, as I mentioned, the SEC regulations that have been rather controversial, which could affect companies and directors more broadly. I think those are areas that will be ripe for some regulatory judicial, I should say, because now it's trending towards the judiciary making those decisions. But I think there'll be some important changes there.
Well, Maureen, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So I just want to say thank you so much for providing that excellent breakdown.
My pleasure.
You can learn more about these topics on Wilson Sonsini's website. And thank you so much for listening and watching the show.